Hello and welcome to Chapter 4 of Internal Auditing. This chapter, we're going to look at risk management. We're also going to look at a couple of websites, ETSU's internal audit website and also Kansas State, K-State's internal audit website to see how some of this stuff is being used, being applied in real world in comparison to what's being talked about here in theory. So we'll just briefly go through this Chapter 4. Try not to talk as long as I did last time. I think I went on for more than 30 minutes last time. Didn't intend to. But page 4-1, risk management is defined there, that third paragraph from the bottom, which refers back to governance, which we talked about last time. Risk management is depicted as the middle layer, really, of the governance structure. Risk management is intended to identify and mitigate the risk that may adversely affect the organization's success. And some of this is risk reduction and some of it is risk avoidance. And also exploring the opportunities that enable success. So it's about being successful as well as making sure you've got good controls for your risk. Now, if you turn over to 4-3, what is risk? Maybe we assume too much of what is risk. And risk is used in a lot of ways, right? Risky, going above the speed limit. If you go 5 miles more than the speed limit, you're probably okay. 10 miles an hour. The faster you go, the more apt you're going to get caught, right? The risk associated with it, the risk and the cost of getting a speeding ticket or driving reckless or having an accident. All of those are potential outcomes from taking on more risk. Financially, when you look at bond ratings, S&P and Moody's, to name two, do classifications of companies' risk. Obviously, the more risky your financial position is, meaning the more likely to file Chapter 11 or worse, then the higher the interest rate you have to pay on funds that you borrow, right? Your lending company is going to require that you bump up your interest rate that you're going to pay for those bonds. Same way with or for notes through banks, or for bonds. If I'm selling bonds to retail investors or institutions, if you're a risky structure financially, a lot of debt, then you have to pay a higher rate of interest than someone who's a very solid company. So there's a risk premium. You probably heard the term junk bonds, high yield bonds, same thing, more or less. And these are bonds that are questionable in nature from the standpoint of the companies really struggling financially. I know, having worked for Exide, they were like that, had really high interest rates that they paid on bonds that were sold. But when you look at junk bonds versus good quality companies, the junk bond spread being between the 10-year treasury and what they're going to pay is typically around 5%. Now, right now, that it's pretty narrow. It's not 5%. It's more like maybe 2.7%. And the 10-year treasury currently is about 1.6%, very low, extremely low from where it's been in the past. Going all the way back to 1981, where it's around 16%. But if it's 1.6% right now, the 10-year treasury, if you have a risk premium of about 5% or spread, then a junk bond is going to pay more like 6.5% or 6.6%. 1.6 plus 5 is 6.6%. So you get more interest, but you have more risk to your principal. And it's not, when you're buying bonds from a company, it's all about what you want to make sure you get your principal back is more important than the actual payment of the interest payments that are there. So that's just another way to look at what is risk. And this applies to internal audit of trying to or attempting to make sure you have a good risk assessment. Now, when you look at bottom page 4-3, and in fact, the definition there in COSA, Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, middle of the page on 4-3, says here that the possibility that an event will occur and adversely affect the achievement of an objective. That's what is defined in that Treadway Commission, COSO, for risk. And so risk begins by strategy formulation, policy development, objective setting. It's not a single point when we talk about risk. It's a sliding scale. There's a range of possible outcomes, like I gave you with the speeding ticket, right? Or not a ticket, but speeding. It's a sliding scale. Risks aren't just about preventing bad things from happening, but it's also about really ensuring good things happen as well, especially driving bottom line performance. So we turn to 4-4, and then COSO, they go into the COSO ERM framework, the enterprise risk management. And the objectives that are there on page 4-5, I mean, I'm not going to read this to you. You can read the text for yourself, which is an important part of this online course. Obviously, strategic objectives, operational objectives, reporting objectives, and then compliance. But then they go into the components of ERM. And this really goes hand in hand or dovetails what you're seeing there with ETSUs. And I'm going to pull that up here. I guess I'll go ahead and do it now. And you can see how what is in the text here in these next few pages goes along with what here is on ETSU's website. So this is ETSU. This is a link there in your D2L site. You give a lot of definitions there. What are internal controls? What's the objectives? Safeguarding assets, operational efficiency, right? It's not just about catching stuff. Compliance with applicable laws and regulations, accuracy and reliability of financial reporting. Why are they important? What are the components? And so this is where what's in the textbook here on 4-6 goes along with what ETSU has. And hopefully I'm screen sharing that. You can see that the internal controls are composed of the following interrelated components that work together to achieve the university's goals. And the first one's the control environment. And that's on page 4-6, although they leave off the word control, it says internal environment. Management sets a policy, management sets the philosophy regarding risk. And what's the risk appetite? What's your risk appetite for speeding? You probably don't think about wrecking, but you do think about getting a $125 speeding ticket, right? What's your risk appetite? And going into the details there. Then on the bottom of page 4-7 is the next one there, the risk assessment. And to continue on, there's control activities, information communication, and monitoring. All right, and then it breaks that out into the control environment. Not all these are broken out, but this one is control environment here with giving you specifics there. Policies and procedures by HR, how important that is. The structure, organizational charts. That's the control environment, which is on page 4-6, 4-7. Then the risk assessment, which is the bottom of page 4-7. What is the risk assessment? ETSU defines it as the evaluation to determine the areas and functions within the university and each department that have risk of errors, noncompliance, and fraud. 3 different areas. Errors which are unintentional, noncompliance which may or may not be intentional, and then fraud, right, which is intentional. All that's a part of your risk assessment. And that's described in your text there in 4-7 and 4-8. I like the fact they point out in the text on 4-8 the difference between avoidance and reduction. Then, well, what's the difference? Reduction is something that you've already had as an issue that you're trying to reduce the potential for that to occur. Avoidance is putting in the measures before they actually happen. I can give you an example in manufacturing whenever you are actually trying to purchase purchase assets or invest in assets for your operation, that scrap reduction is always key, or scrap removal. but we would talk about scrap reduction and scrap avoidance. Well, what's the difference between scrap reduction and scrap avoidance? Scrap reduction is you are already having that type of scrap occur. It's real dollars that have hit your ledger. And so investing in assets to reduce scrap, you spend X number of dollars, you save X number of dollars. Very easy to calculate payback. But scrap avoidance is investing dollars in equipment that maybe is a new process that you're going to avoid the potential for scrap. You haven't incurred that in the past, but if you don't invest in this, you will incur that in the future. So there's a difference. I think this applies here with what you're reading about risk assessment as well. Avoidance and reduction are two different things. You can read more about that on your own. The next one here on top of page 4-9 is control activities, which again here at ETSU is right there also in what I'm screen sharing. Control activities, if I click on that one here below, they give you several items there which are listed in the book as well. Not always the same order. One that always jumps out at you is what? Segregation of duties. That's always a big one for risk assessment. The more people involved in a process, the less chance you have for fraud. But you become more inefficient as well. Sometimes you want to have some inefficiency for the sake of safeguarding of assets and for segregation of duties, right? And so those are listed on page 4-9 along with here on ETSU's website. The next one there is information and communication. Which is down the page a little bit there. There it is. Having adequate information communication systems help the university personnel obtain and process information as needed to carry on and control the operations of the university. All right. 4-9 down at the bottom talks about having appropriate and the right level of detail, timely and available when needed, accurate, reliable, very important. Having information communication. You know, COSO says that on page 4-10. COSO goes on to say effective communication also occurs flowing down across and up the organization. No hoarding of information, keeping people, you know, they use that word transparency a lot. And then the last one here is monitoring. And then there's a segment here which talks specifically what does that mean. Again, the book does a more thorough job than what ETSU has here on the website, but all these are important. And then they go into what are some of the limitations. Of course, that's getting beyond the internal controls, but it's obviously dependent upon the competence of the people who use it, which is a big part of internal control, is having qualified people in positions. Overriding of controls is a limitation. Collusion of 2 or more people, right? 2 people may keep a secret, 3 rarely can. Rule of thumb. If you got a small organization, segregation there of duties, it gets to be really difficult. Larger companies, you don't have that issue of segregation of functions. K-State as well. Let me see if I can share that. I think I'm sharing it, but let me go back and, yeah. K-State has something similar. For internal control, internal audit at their university. Elements of internal control, there it is, the control environment. Policies and procedures, that was on the other one, was it? Risk assessment, control activities, information communication, monitoring. Components of control activity. They go into some detail there with physical restrictions on assets, segregation of duties is mentioned. So I would encourage you to read both ETSU's and K-State. I don't have access to a private or publicly traded corporation, But I do have access, or we do have access to universities like this that are state funded. All right. Now back to the text here. 4-11, ERM, roles and responsibilities. Of course, board of directors, a lot of this is very basic. Board of directors, and you have management under board of directors. And oftentimes the board of directors has special committees that oversee. Usually you have at least a finance committee. Talked about that last time. That reports to the board of directors. That's comprised of some of the board of directors and maybe the controller of the, or director of finance of the subject company. Some companies even, of course, management, some companies even have a risk officer on page 412. They call it a CRO, Chief Risk Officer. CASO here talks about specifics. And then we get over to page 4-14, which is the rest of this chapter. It has to do with ISO 31000:2009, risk management principles and guidelines. You can read that for yourself. I'm not going to state the obvious to you. Role of the internal audit function in ERM in 417. I like that funnel they show on the top of page 417, the top-down view of enterprise risk management, ERM 4-3, top of page 417. That's governance controls, management oversight. At the top of the funnel, process level, funneling down to transaction level. Now, that's where the rubber meets the road, where the transaction flows through the funnel here. So you can see, and they show the risk there, the risk appetite going from inherent risk at the top, gross risk, entity level controls, additional mitigating and compensating controls, and then finally the residual risk, which should be very small based on what you've set forth. Sort of a fan chart there on top of page 418 as well. Legitimate internal audit roles with safeguards is a yellow section in the middle. And then on the right in red, what should internal audit not do? Well, they're not setting the risk appetite. They're just implementing and maintaining whatever has been determined from the board of directors and from management. And then the green are the core internal audit roles in regard to ERM. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. And that will be chapter 4. So again, turn in the assignment for chapter 4. Let me get my handy syllabus out here for what I have put in here. For module 1 deliverable, you can see the due date there in your D2L. Chapter 4, case 1, all multiple choice questions. Case 1 again should be 1,000 words minimum. Please type that up, 12 font, and turn that in, submit to the Dropbox. And that's the end of module 1. So next time we'll start in on chapter 5 and module 2. I hope you have a great day. Again, contact me if you have any questions.